Good afternoon, and welcome to the penultimate session of this Nobel in Africa workshop. We're now going to be talking about labor markets and migration. My name is Michael Sachs. I'm from Wits University in Johannesburg, and it's my pleasure to introduce first Supreet Kaur from Berkeley. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for including or inviting us onto the program, and thank you for bearing with us. I know it's been a very full set of days. So let me just start by relaying what many of you have heard many times, which is that labor is the most abundant resource of people in poverty, and it's also by far the largest factor input into production in poor countries. And so, it's for these reasons that the earliest literature and development really put labor front and center in thinking about the process of growth and development. So if labor markets work well, they should do, I think, three things overall. They should allow people who want jobs to be able to get jobs if they're qualified for them. They should be able to match the right workers to the right jobs, and typically we think that happens through a well-functioning wage mechanism, like wages are what play that allocative role. And the process of structural transformation and growth kind of requires that they allow people who to move from less productive to more productive sectors. And so in thinking about what we've learned in the literature, I'm really going to try to focus and discipline my review of the evidence, keeping these three goals in mind and kind of using them as a lens through which I filter some of the work. And I think Girum, Mushfiq, and I have really tried to coordinate, because there's so much content, to kind of have pretty non-overlapping content. So hopefully we'll manage to get through everything, even though my review will be quite selective. So let me start with just a stylized fact that you've already heard multiple times this week, which is that wage employment tends to be pretty low. So this is just LSMS surveys from West Africa, and if you look in rural areas, it's typically below 15%. If you look in urban areas, it's typically below 50%, and we know there's places where it's much, much, much lower. But if you add self-employment in there, where people are just saying, well, I'm also self-employed, you start getting towards numbers that look a lot more closer to what you might think of as full employment. And so then the key question is really, how do we interpret this low wage employment? One possibility is that this is really just the outcome of pretty well-functioning labor markets where people are just choosing self-employment over what are kind of crappy, low-wage, not attractive jobs. And so if that's true, we have to look elsewhere for growth. We have to look towards human capital development, technological change, expansion in demand, that kind of thing. But the other possibility is that actually this is reflecting tons of involuntary unemployment, and people are just turning to self-employment because it's disguised unemployment. It's just because they don't have anything else to do. And that means that those three goals that we want labor markets to fulfill, they might really be failing in fulfilling those goals. And so distinguishing between these two explanations is an important kind of task in trying to understanding labor markets in developing countries. So the early labor development literature was super, super worried about this problem, and there was this view of, well, is there a lot of involuntary unemployment? And there was tons of theoretical work coming up with a lot of different models for what could generate unemployment in equilibrium in these pretty flexible, non-constrained labor markets where there's no unions, there's no minimum wage laws, and so on. And we had some early tests and evidence for distortions, particularly in the form of separation failures. But overall, there was no evidence sort of documenting that involuntary employment existed or finding any positive evidence for these different micro-foundations that I've listed, those models. And so that made it really difficult to distinguish between these two features of the labor market. And so I think in the last 20 years, we've made a lot of progress in testing for and understanding the presence of at least some frictions. And we've done that, I think, through two kinds of different approaches. So the first approach is just trying to use our new empirical tools that we've gotten in the micro-development literature to assess and characterize the labor market equilibrium. And this work has really drawn on this idea or this feature of developing country labor markets, which is that they tend to be pretty autarkic. So in data that Emily and I have from India, in rural India, the average worker, 90% of labor is done within 5 kilometers of your village. And so that means that we can treat labor markets or village labor markets as local labor markets, as small little economies, and actually do equilibrium analyses that are well identified using kind of causal methods. And Seema really pioneered this idea and this approach in her seminal work in 2006. So So then, if we taking that idea, so if we start with just the Econ 101 reason, why might there be involuntary unemployment? Well, is that that's if the wages are set above market clearing levels. And so kind of one approach, so the one natural test is to say, well, is there downward wage adjustment that happens in these markets? And then one challenge in kind of looking at that is even in the broader economics literature in labor and macro, the way people have traditionally tested for wage rigidity is just by looking at distributions of wage changes. From one year to the next, does the wage change, and is there like a spike of mass at zero, and that tells us there's wage rigidity. But the challenge with that is that there's no way then to know if there's any impact on employment, which is why we really care about wage rigidity, and you might imagine some other measurement and other challenges. So building on Seema's approach, kind of what I did in my job market paper is just to say, well, look, instead of looking at distributions of wage changes, we can just say, do you get wage adjustment to upward versus downward shocks? And kind of the key prediction there and the key finding is that you get asymmetric wage adjustment. When you have positive shocks, wages go up, but when you have negative shocks, you don't see nominal wages adjusting back down. And this methodology then allows for a direct test of employment effects. And what I kind of find is that when wage rigidity binds, you do get decreases in employment. And in fact, while you get decreases in wage employment, you get no change in total employment, because all of that decline in wage employment is made up by small landholders just increasing employment to their own farms. So you can see disguised unemployment. So now, we don't see wage rigidity, I should note, everywhere. I don't think it exists everywhere in developing country labor markets. And Emily and I have tried to do kind of work to try to understand the micro foundations for wage rigidity and think about how that might help us understand heterogeneity. So for example, in parts of Africa where most work is piecework, kind of there's less ability for norms to kind of, or there's more justification for why you would have flexible wages, and you kind of see less rigidity and that sort of thing. And I'll come back to that a bit. So now that might have been an instantiation that there is wage rigidity, but what we really care about is it big? Because the wage employment levels are low in absolute magnitude. So is rigidity, or sorry, not rigidity, but involuntary employment, is it big in absolute terms? So what we do is just kind of, again, draw on a very simple Econ 101 idea and just say, well, what happens if we engineer supply shocks to villages? So what we do is we go into villages and we remove, so this joint work with Emily and Yogita Shamdasani, and we remove about a quarter of the labor force of male casual workers. And so if you remove that many people from the village economy, and then we kind of step back and say, well, what is the local labor market response? What do employers do? What do workers do in that natural labor market? And what we find, looking at what happens to employment and wages, is that in the peak season, labor markets look pretty agile. Like within a week of the shock, wages are up. Local labor demand has adjusted in the way you would expect, kind of in the graph on the right, on the left. But then in the lean season, we find that at least a quarter of the labor force is rationed. And we see a lot of disguised unemployment. When in the lean season jobs become available in people's local labor markets, people who have agricultural businesses and non-agricultural businesses quickly abandon them, and they start doing wage labor for the prevailing wage instead. And so kind of from a revealed preference sense, we sort of see that there is a lot of pent-up demand for wage labor that people aren't being able to get. And this kind of relates to what kind of others have talked about. Now, sort of much using very different approach, like Kevin Donovan, I kind of has some very interesting stylized facts using microdata from 49 countries on labor markets. And one of the things he documents that when you just look at the transitions into and out of wage employment, it does look like, even in that data, that workers are treating self-employment and unemployment kind of symmetrically. So there is reason to think that there is a lot of disguised unemployment going on kind of more broadly. So, so what is the implication of this sort of then line of thought? Well, one is that two core assumptions of well-functioning labor markets are no longer true. So one thing we assume when labor markets work well is that workers are on their labor supply curve. But that's not true if you have double-digit rationing, where people are involuntarily unemployed. The second is that the wage, if you have rationing, well then now the wage is not playing an allocative role to production. So you have a different mechanism that's allocating labor to production, and the wage may not necessarily equal the marginal product of labor. It may or may not, depending on the micro foundation. And that kind of very much supports kind of this rich body of work on separation failures that we have in development. So that's important, and when we think about future work, because that means that a lot of the approaches we currently have to doing labor market analysis may not necessarily hold anymore. So if you think about how we think about sectoral wage gaps, the misallocation literature, spatial analyses of what is the amenity value of living in one place versus another place, value-added estimates, all of those are kind of relying on these top two assumptions holding. And if you have double-digit rationing, then we need new theoretical and empirical approaches to now thinking about these very important questions that these literatures are studying, because otherwise there's a potential for getting misleading estimates. This also suggests pretty problematic implications for welfare. And so we kind of know from Anjani Kocher's work and then Seema's work and Kelsey's work that labor supply is a key way that people consumption smooth in developing countries. It's like a key consumption smoothing mechanism. But what we see through the body of evidence is that there seems to be this counter-cyclical force on labor market earnings, where earnings have a potential to fall exactly when you most need the money. So when you have negative shocks and it creates rationing, it might be harder to find jobs exactly when you need them the most. As Seema and Kelsey's work have shown, if you have correlated smoothing strategies across people, because in these settings shocks often tend to be aggregate, then you're going to have general equilibrium effects on real wages that are again going to depress labor market returns. And then finally, as Pascaline pointed out in her talk, we have this incredibly high rate of health shocks in developing countries. There's enormous morbidity. There's so many people who are sick all the time. But if you can only earn money to raise money to pay for medicines or to deal with your health shock if you work in the labor market, but you have a health shock, well then that's going to make it very hard for you to undertake the manual labor that you need to then buy that medicine. And I think this is very underexplored, and we don't have a lot of work here, and I think is actually a big evidence gap. But taken together, I think this means that what we think of as the key consumption smoothing strategy of the poor has an extremely problematic covariance with the marginal utility of consumption. And so, and thinking about those welfare effects, I think is still quite underexplored in the development literature. The other a second set of approach that people then have taken to think about frictions is to use active labor market programs. So this idea is that we can look at the impact of a bunch of policy interventions that people have done to boost employment or wages, and the reaction or the impacts of those programs give us some insight into whether there are frictions and what those frictions might be. And so this has been like incredibly active area of research. Girum is going to talk a lot more about it, so I'm going to do like a very quick summary. So there's work on evaluating the impacts of workfare, where the estimates are everywhere. It's like from zero in like Kathleen Beagle and Jessica Goldberg's work to like negative impacts on the private labor market and Baron Pop, to like positive effects in Karthik's paper. With others, and Emily and my rationing paper kind of, I think we do explicit analysis to try to reconcile some of this, why you might get responsiveness or not, and it's going to just depend on the baseline level of slack in the economy, how much involuntary unemployment there is in the economy. But I think the fact that you could have demand externalities is very intriguing and interesting, and kind of I think something we need to explore and replicate and think more about. So, but then after that, people have done things like demand-side subsidies, programs where you give short-run employment subsidies, where you tend to not have impacts, as Chris and others talked about in the earlier sessions. People have tried to give people supply-side training, like short skills vocational training. And for most of these, we don't see a lot of persistence. The effects, if they're there, are pretty small. The notable exceptions are this Mitra and Money paper, where they teach people to sew, and Oriana and Robin's work on vocational training through Brock. And there, even in that paper, they sort of do two things. They get people to be hired in firms and get trained, or they give them vocational training. And they find that in both those cases, people do seem to learn new skills, but it's only the vocational training that seems to have long-run impacts. And they interpret this as evidence that it's really the certification effects of vocational training. And I think that brings me kind of to the place where I think we have seen impacts from these active labor market policies, which is things that try to address search and matching frictions. So there we see evidence for effects from things like job placement or skills certification and so on, where less impact for other things like transport costs. And so there is some evidence that maybe some of these things can move behavior, which means that it might be hard for employers to find the right workers, even though those workers are out there. That might be something for us to think more about. The one sort of, I think, very deep-seated puzzle in this literature that we haven't made a lot of progress on is just this stylized fact that, like, everywhere job seekers have like crazy over-optimistic beliefs. Like, they just think, like, I'm going to go in the labor market, I'm going to make like a bunch of money, I'm going to get a job in like 2 weeks, and it's like completely not true. And so we have some work on addressing this, but I think we haven't really scratched the surface about why these beliefs exist and why they persist in equilibrium. But I think taking all of this active labor market policy stuff as a whole, I think one concern is that even when we are seeing positive effects, we don't really know if this isn't just displacement. Is it just that treatment workers are just displacing other workers in the economy who otherwise would have gotten the job? And so while these policies are surely generating some improvements, like vacancies are posted for less time, jobs are firms are filling jobs faster, and so on, it's not clear that this is is this a first order effect? Are we really increasing the size of the pie in a meaningful way? And I think that's like an important direction for more work in this space. So we have these two approaches, and they kind of we've seen there's some evidence for frictions, but it's especially when we're thinking about kind of non-agricultural jobs, how should we think about the low levels of wage employment? And so another possibility is just that wage employment is low because workers are just not employable for good jobs, and so then that implies the need for human capital investment. So what is the evidence base for that? So we have work on primary school investment that does seem, so Esther's work and the Miguel and Kramer work that does seem to produce long-run impacts on adult wages and earnings. As Esther talked about, the evidence on secondary school completion, we see limited labor market impacts. So the stuff we have, it maybe works for some groups and not others. Maybe you see a little bit of effect on something, but there's not really anything that's very overwhelming. But I think kind of what's more important is just how few studies there are. Like, I don't have more than 4 things that I could have put on the slide, at least that I'm aware of, that are well identified. And given the importance of this topic, that really surprised me. So I think this is just a really important area where we need a lot more research, because we have this very strong prior that human capital investment is important. In the US literature, that is the view that really that's the main thing you can do to people to help boost their long-run earnings. But I don't know that you can look at the evidence we have in development and say that that's true. So we need to understand that better. The other thing that I think we have to address is what is the right measure for human capital in this setting? We tend to kind of follow the US approach, years of schooling, and now, it's improved as we saw in the education session, how much do you actually know, what are your test scores? But if you actually look at surveys of employers, that's not what they're talking about. So this is actually, the best evidence I could find is this JEL article by Bowles and Gintis and Osborne, where they actually are taking surveys of US and UK employers who employ low-wage workers. And by far, what they think is most important is not what you know. It's these other traits about you. Are you showing up regularly? What is your, affect and so on when you're at work and so on? And if you talk to developing country employers, this is now just anecdotal, you hear very similar things. It's not about do you know how to, do this particular skill? And so when we're thinking about measuring human capital and we're thinking about our labor force surveys, this is a huge area, I think, of a measurement gap that we kind of need to think about, and it might change the way we think about active labor market policies and so on. So let me go back to kind of these goals. And so, there seems to be some serious gaps on the welfare side. We see from kind of the search and matching friction stuff that there is some constraints to, and the separation failures literature on kind of the allocation of labor to production. But we also see labor market responsiveness and so on. So what about this idea that is the labor market enabling workers to move from less to more productive sectors? And we think that, that growth requires moving from agricultural to non-agricultural sectors, from casual to formal jobs. And obviously in that process, there's really important roles for technological change, for firm growth, for complementary capital, as we've seen from Oriana and Robin's work on the ultra-poor programs. But I think the thing to ask is there something about the labor market that might be inhibiting this process from happening more rapidly? And I think to answer that question, or to understand that question, we have to contend with what I think is a real puzzle in labor supply behavior. So often workers don't want stable full-time jobs if you offer it to them. So this is work from Florian Grosset's job market paper, where he has a sample of young people who say, I want a factory job, yeah, sign me up for this list. And then he goes to them and actually offers them factory jobs that pay twice as much as what they're currently earning per hour relative to their baseline earnings, and 25% of them take it up. In India, among urban labor stand workers who are doing construction, who've kind of been at a labor stand for, say, that this is their primary source of income for 10 years, they get work about 3 days a week. And if you ask them, would you take up a long-term job if you were offered it, only 31% say, yeah, I want that kind of job. And then there's work in Jordan that kind of has similar facts. So the second thing is when people do accept jobs, they don't stay at them for very long. We have incredibly high turnover. So this is work from Wu and Loletta, which is from 21 factories in Ethiopia, and you kind of see that 25% of people leave within a week, 43% turnover in the first year. This is Blattman Durkin were kind of the first, I think, to really bring this to the fore in micro development work, where they see similarly like very high turnover, and also some real things like negative health effects, which might say, well, maybe this is also just reasonable because these jobs are like crappy jobs. I think what we don't know is we don't actually have great measurement on amenities and these kinds of preferences, and something we need to build out, because my suspicion is if you're doing a construction job, a lot of people are getting hurt on those jobs too. They're getting maimed. They're not, it's like they're jackhammering without shoes on, like that sort of thing. And so it's not clear how to then think about that. Similarly, if you look at turnover in Côte d'Ivoire, it's 60% in the first year. In Bangladesh, this is data from Laura Boudreau and Rachel Heath. So this is actually a representative survey of 1,300 export-oriented garment factories, so exactly the kinds of jobs we think allow upskilling. And they have about a quarter of workers' turnover in the first 3 months, even in this very well-established sector. In India, this is from Ach and Anant's work. Again, you have about 10 to 15% turnover in steady state every month. So every month, you're like shedding that many workers. It looks a little bit better in the services sectors in Latin America. And then finally, for people who do stay in jobs, there's incredibly high absenteeism. So again, this is from Florian's data in Côte d'Ivoire. So this is a factory that just opened, the top dotted line is the labor force, is how many people should show up to work every day, and you see the red line of how many are actually showing up to work every day. And so this mean absenteeism is 40%. In our social tax paper, it's different factories than these in Côte d'Ivoire. We have an absenteeism rate of 37% per day. If things look better in factories that have explicit policies against you get fired if you don't show up, but even those factories, like including one of the one on the right, the India one, is one of the 5 largest garment exporters in the world, so incredibly successful. Their absenteeism rate is 15% a day. So think about a firm that has to manage a supply chain or a production line. This level of volatility just wreaks havoc on your ability to like plan or so on. And so when we think about low labor productivity, it could very well be that this is actually a really important component of why labor productivity is low in developing countries from the perspective of firms, and why it might be hard for firms to be profitable. Okay, but this is not just a formal phenomenon. So if you go back to our data on urban labor stand workers in India, and you ask employers, if you hire someone for a 10-day job, how many days are going to be absent? People expect about a 20 to 30% absence rate. This is also not just an urban phenomenon. So go back to rural jobs that people have been doing forever in spot labor markets. In Nick Swanson's job market paper in Burundi, he has 1,300 employers, 4,000 employment contracts that he looks at, and about 25% of the time, workers don't show up for the job to weed the land or whatever, which is like 2 days in the future. So 2 days ago, the farmer said, hey, will you come weed my land? 2 days later, 25% of people are not showing up who said they would. And we see similar numbers in our data from villages in India, just so massive absenteeism. So the one thing to note is this is not unique about now. If you go back to the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, people talked about labor in exactly the same way. The labor force had exactly the same characteristics. So I think this gives rise to this question, which is that could low labor supply actually be a feature or consequence of underdevelopment, not only a cause of it? And is it possible that the structure of institutions in society in low-income economies could create conditions that actually depress labor supply? And so that means that this absenteeism and so on might be, at least to some extent, not about the worker, but just about the environment of poverty itself. And so why might we think that should be the case? And I think there's like 2 sets of reasons. The first is one of the things that the process of development does is it moves us from an economy where exchange is incredibly interpersonal. So if you're in a village, you're like buying things and selling things to people who you like know. You're not going to Walmart and buying a hammer anonymously. And as we develop, we kind of move to this more anonymous market exchange. So you're trading with people that you know, and in addition, social ties matter a lot because you rely on in your network for tons of things: social insurance, safety, job referrals, and so on. And so that means that there's enormous scope for social considerations to kind of affect economic exchange and economic behavior. And so let me give you some examples of that. So in Florian Grosset's job market paper, right, this 25% of people took up factory jobs when they were offered. That was the control group. What he does is he then randomizes whether other people in your network are also offered jobs, and he looks at what happens to your labor supply. And what he finds is that people are 63% more likely to accept the job offer for this formal factory job. He reduces turnover by 95%. In terms of 4 months later, who's actually at the factory, and he sees complementarity in labor supply and attendance. So in each of those dimensions, just having people in your network that are working in the same shift as you has a massive impact on labor supply. If we think about what Mushfiq will talk about, which is large rural-urban wage gaps, and this idea that one of the things we need is maybe to kind of move laborers from rural to urban areas to enable structural transformation, and there's this big puzzle of why is there too little of it. Well, one of the really interesting things that Mushfiq does is he, in one of his follow-up studies, varies the share of the village that gets how many people in the village are getting this like migration offer to try to go migrate in the city. And what he finds is in villages where many people have gotten this bus ticket to get them to go to the city, there's a 34% increase in the propensity of the control group to also migrate in a way that's sustained, like even after a year later the migration incident happened. And so what that means is that people are willing to drastically increase their labor supply under the right social conditions. And I think we don't really understand why. Is it the amenity value of the network? Is it social insurance? I think this is something for more work. But what it also suggests is that there's the possibility of multiple equilibria in aggregate labor supply levels. And there's a theoretical paper by Hoff and Sen that kind of makes that argument. And they make that argument actually for the purposes of this mechanism, which is the social tax, where we know that in developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, there's this huge pressure to share your income with other people. And so, for example, in our work, we ask factory workers, if someone in the community decides to start working for a factory, would people start asking that person more often for financial help? And like 75% of people agree or strongly agree with that statement. So what we do is we actually give people the ability to shield their income from redistributive requests, and we see a 10% increase in attendance and an 11% increase in earnings. Nick Swanson has work sort of documenting pressure to hire relatives distorts kind of firm hiring decisions with effects on labor productivity for this reason. And what this also tells us is just like the previous thing, that labor supply might be low, but there's a lot of people in the economy who want to work more than they're currently working. This is one potential reason for that. And again, that suggests the possibility of multiple equilibria in labor supply. We also have a bunch of evidence on the role of social norms, that they really dictate, cultural connotations and norms dictate kind of what is acceptable work, the value of work, and there's real or perceived costs of violating those norms. And so we have work on why this is relevant for female labor force participation, for why people in one caste may not, move to a different caste job. And it might help us understand things like why is it in some regions of West Africa you rarely ever see anybody working in the wage labor market in villages, and it's because it's considered incredibly humiliating to work for somebody else. And could that be like a reason to help us understand the lack of labor markets in some places? So these social norms that kind of govern behavior that you don't want to violate could aggregate up to real things. So this is survey work that Emily, Nandita, and I did, where we go to casual agricultural workers and also urban labor stand workers in both India and Kenya. But also like taxi drivers and roti sellers and butcher shops, like kind of a variety of different people. And we just asked them, would you ever cut the wage if you haven't had, income in a while, work in a while, and everybody's like, no, you wouldn't do that. That's like unacceptable. And you ask them about what the consequences would be, and just it's like being like social exclusion. People like wouldn't let you come to that labor stand anymore to work the next day. You'd be driven out of business. Like all of these things kind of come up very strongly in all of these different kinds of markets. And then, so what we do is test this formally among, in the lean season where there's 50% unemployment rates, and we have employers offer workers jobs at different wages. And what we find is that when you offer a job below the prevailing wage in status quo, like other people kind of would know they did it, like nobody takes up that job. Even though there's 50% unemployment, no one will take a 10% wage cut. But if it's private, you get about a quarter of people doing it. And so this norm that is surely there to protect workers' bargaining power with employers, one of the things that's doing is it's altering the labor supply, aggregate labor supply curve so that it looks perfectly elastic in the prevailing wage, which might then be driving kind of those wage floors that we see. So these norms are kind of important enough that they really can aggregate up to change the market equilibrium. Yeah. So I think the last thing I want to, the second thing I want to briefly mention is that the other thing that the process of development does is help institutions become more regular. So for example, things like health shocks and family shocks, could that be a reason for absenteeism? We just don't have a lot of evidence. The fact that people are self-employed and can choose when they want to work, well, that creates a lot more scope for self-control problems to affect labor supply behavior. In developing countries, you could have a wedding on a Thursday, there's like a festival on a Tuesday, and like everybody has to take off work. There isn't this idea that weddings are only on weekends and so on. And there's just less opportunity for regular habituation. There's like work seasonality, people don't have, like school absenteeism rates are really high among students and so on. And so that could be that this in itself creates an endogeneity of preferences for regular work. And so to document this, we go, just to sort of give a sense, when you ask casual workers, why do you prefer casual work to regular work, these people who said, I don't want a regular job, of course, the main reason is people actually do think per day, even if they earn less overall, they do earn more per day in casual work. So that, of course, wages are important, and we shouldn't forget that. But a lot of people are just saying, I don't want to have a fixed schedule. I don't want to have to be somewhere. I want to be able to choose. So people have this preference for flexibility. And so what we do to kind of test that is that could there be habit formation in labor supply? We incentivize workers, so we test for this habit formation and work with Heather Schofield and Louisa Shafala and Yogira Shamdasani. We incentivize workers to come to the labor stand for 2 months where we just boost labor supply. Every day you show up, you get some money from us, like 50 rupees in Chennai, India. And then we remove the incentives. And what we find is that once we remove the incentives, we see persistent increases in labor supply for 2 to 5 months. We kind of see what you might expect from a habit formation model playing out. And there's some suggestive thing of a change in preferences. People are 10 percentage points more likely to take up a job offer that we give them for a work contract that penalizes absences. So this sort of implies that these features of developing country environments might make it hard to build up habit stocks. And in fact, one of the really interesting stylized facts from Kevin Donovan's work is that he documents that actually when you see people moving from traditional to non-traditional jobs, like to the urban or non-agricultural sector, this is not existing workers. This is all driven by new cohorts of workers. It's like new entrants to the labor markets are the ones who are making this transition. And that might be consistent with sort of this idea that Bowles and Gintis and even Marx have espoused, that one of the things that education expansion did during the Industrial Revolution is just teach people how to be more regular. You have to be somewhere every day. It creates this habit of like regularity, which then really affects people's willingness and ability to be regular factory workers. Of course, that's speculative. Okay, so I think then the last slide I have is basically just to document, just to say that so there might be this bidirectional relationship with the organization of production. Workers might attend work more, of course, if jobs were better, like wages and amenities and so on, and this is something I think that we take away from the Blattman-Durkin work. But it might also be that employers would offer better jobs if workers were more productive. And so in surveys of employers, we asked employers, would you hire more workers in longer-term contracts if they could come more regularly? And 71% say definitely. They also say they would invest in workers more by providing them training. They would expand their businesses and also even change the kind of construction work they're doing. Like endogenously, they would actually change, right? The nature of labor contracts would become different. The nature of firms would become different. And they would also just be more likely to offer these non-wage amenities and wages that we think, might be a reason why existing jobs are so crappy. So I think we've made a lot of progress in the last 20 years where we have these active responsive labor markets, and we have these substantial frictions that can impede welfare and labor allocation goals, but we still need a lot more work understanding what are the micro foundations for these frictures, what are the implications, for example, for consumption smoothing. And in terms of the barriers to structural transformation, we need a lot more evidence on human capital accumulation. We need better measurement. And we need to think about this idea that there might be multiple equilibria that might be impeding structural transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Girum Abebe from the World Bank in Addis.
I don't see the slide, so I can start talking. All right, there you go. Hey, everyone. Thanks a lot for organizers for having me. It has been really quite educational for me as well. Even now, it would have been really preferable for me to sit there and absorb all this, excellent presentation that Supreet did. So here is what I'm going to do. It is often very difficult to be the last presenter, right? Particularly in labor, because one or the other way, it's a cross-sectional, it has a cross-sectional element, so it's going to be touched by previous discussions. You look at firms, trade, gender, it is going to be affected one or the other way. So what I'll do is I'll try to quickly show you some of what I think are stylized facts in this market, in the labor market, and what we have learned from this and what we still don't know, at least in my opinion. And then I'll pick up two of the kind of important aspects that we have tried to do quite a lot of work. One is in relation to active labor market policies, and the other is inclusion policies, particularly with respect to how to improve the labor market outcomes of women in low-income countries. And finally, if time permits, I'm going to quickly discuss about what I think are exciting avenues for future research. Now, moving on. All right, so this is no-brainer, right? We know that open unemployment is less of a problem, and underemployment is what we are often concerned about in low-income countries. But in all the surveys that we have seen, we always, observe that unemployment rates at the national level are quite low, and partly because, as I said, it's an issue because we don't have very good measurement of underemployment in rural areas, and we actually don't do quite a good job in understanding the tightness of markets in these areas. And all of the kind of active labor market policies, job search support, or most of the interventions that have happened in this space have happened in urban areas. Maybe going forward, if we can understand the nature of labor market friction that exists there, how the markets works there, would be one area that I think would be useful to think about. Second, I don't want to belabor this point because it has been mentioned several times. If we look at the structure of employment, it tends to be mostly, in informal sector in low-income countries, while wage employment over time has increased. If you compare, for example, Asia and Africa, in the last 3 decades, what we observed is that the share of wage employment has remained really, really low in Africa, less than 20%. And growth is not necessarily producing all the important jobs that might absorb young unemployed people into gainful employment. In fact, the wage elasticity of the growth elasticity of wage has been quite low. In Asia, it is twice that of Africa, meaning that growth is not necessarily, producing all the important jobs that could contribute towards poverty reduction in the continent. Now, the other point is that this is a point that Supreet also just flagged. We know that re-employment rates are low. When people particularly lose, formal jobs, the possibility that they will end up in formal employment tends to be quite limited. We replicate the project that Stefan and Blattman did in Ethiopia. We also observe that turnover rates are very high, similar to the Cote d'Ivoire project that Supreet had shown that. Now, what I think we don't know about is that not just drivers of turnover, but what are the costs of turnover for the firms. Potentially, these are premature separations that are happening before the quality of the match is revealed from both the worker side and both from the firm side. Because most of the separation or the quits are happening at the either first or between the first and the 6 months of employment. And this may not give sufficient time for the workers to sort of, understand the job requirements and whether they are cut out for this kind of jobs or not. This is the issue of structural transformation. Whenever we talk about employment and in low-income countries, we have always thought about employment in manufacturing, in industrialization. But what we see is that the structure of the economy seems to be shifting toward the services. Employment seems to be also being created in the service sector. So the kind of jobs that are being created in this sector would be something of an interest, I think, moving forward as well. And we also know that there is substantial gender gaps in the labor market. It's not just, female labor force participation. It is also about, other important labor market outcomes, such as earnings, for example. In a gender diagnostic report that the World Bank did in Nigeria and Ethiopia, even after conditioning for human capital indicators, there are substantial earning differences that remains between male and female workers. And this tends to be persist throughout the continent. And if you go to the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, it tends to be even magnified. I think this is one area where we want to understand how we can support women move through the career ladders and narrow the gender gap, because part of the gap arises because women are often confined into low occupations that do not necessarily generate high returns. Now, we also know that unlike high-income countries, in low-income countries, workers are not protected against job loss. There is almost no unemployment insurance. What we know is that there are, severance pay, and evidence from Brazil and in ongoing work in Ethiopia. We also observe that severance pay is not really supportive of consumption smoothing. There is a tendency to overconsume, the severance pay that people receive in the first 2 months and then fall back into, poverty or self-employment. Now, urbanization is increasing in the continent in many low-income countries. That would definitely create jobs, new jobs would be created, but also it means, spatial and informational dislocation would become important. Where people live and where jobs are created might be different, and this would magnify or amplify the importance of active labor market policies. Now, what are the evidences that we have seen? Now, whenever I talk about active labor market policies or job facilitation support, the one thing that I have been advised to do is always to start with labor demand. Because if there are not enough jobs to go around, the tinkering on the margins may not necessarily move the needle. So the advice is that really what are the policies that can create more jobs, that can avail more jobs? And this has been a topic of discussion yesterday in the firm session, in the trade session. You talk about macroeconomic stability, predictable environment, industrial parks, and so forth. But in general, the interventions around supporting firms to create vacancies or subsidizing recruitment costs has not really yielded substantial or robust evidence, and this remains a topic of interest. And labor supply, I think this has been extensively discussed by Supreet, only to say that while these labor supply-based interventions, thinking about imparting important skills, both vocational, life skill, mindset, and so forth, the evidence seems to be quite mixed, and there is quite a lot that we can learn. And mobility can be manifested in various forms. You could look at geographic mobility, where I think Mushfiq is going to talk about how, mobility would be very important to locate people from low productive to higher productive areas, particularly in lean seasons. And then what I think would grow in importance is the conversation around fragility, conflict, and violence, internal displacement, and refugees. We actually don't know much about how local labor markets respond to the entry of new entrants coming from different areas with different characteristics. And this is going to be important, particularly in the Sahel region and East Africa. Now I'm going to focus about this, what we call active labor market policies, and start with search. Search is going to be very important. Search is a self-managed process. People would decide to search or not, depending on various dimensions. One important dimension is going to be monetary cost. Obviously, there is psychological cost to search. There is physical cost. Time would be required as well. But we know from earlier research is that search can be a significant barrier because it eats into a resource that is limited. Like in Addis Ababa, people spend around 60% of their income on search-related activities. In Johannesburg, it's around 18%. And search cost can also have exclusionary impact, right? People who live away from the city center are less likely to search and more likely to be excluded from potentially productive employment. So what can we do to support search? So the evidence tends to be various layers. So the one thing that we see is that perhaps subsidizing search in terms of transport subsidy could work, but there is a big caveat here. It's like opening the faucet and closing the faucet. Search intensity increases when you provide transport subsidy. The moment that you take that away, search returns back to the pre-subsidy level. Application subsidy is something that that caught us by surprise its effect, because when we offered application subsidy in Addis Ababa, it didn't only increase the quantity of applicants, more talented applicants who otherwise would have been excluded from the labor market because of liquidity constraints got to be included in applications as well. Skill signaling is also another important aspect. From Ralph's work in South Africa, we understand that people don't have the ability to convey their inherent productivity to prospective employers, so certifying their skills and through reference letter or test certification programs could support. And one additional aspect related with that is, behavior also matters. I think Ralph's work, intention to action gap, is something that can tell us to what extent, people fail to plan, and because of that, their search efficacy, job offers, and employment rate could be constrained. Now, another important dimension is information. People's understanding about the functioning of the labor market could be constrained because they don't have sufficient information about the parameters of the market. This includes the wage rate that would be offered in the market. They have inflated expectation of the wage. It can include, re-employability rate if they leave their current employer. Really bringing the employers and employees together might be one way to sort of have them share this important information. But again, there is mixed evidence on this. Job fairs have been typically used to do that, but the evidence has not been that stellar. Now, moving on to gender, we know that women are less likely to work, and even if they work, they are more likely to work in occupation that tends to generate lower returns than men. So what does the literature say about the kind of intervention that works? There seems to be a relatively stronger argument to be made for childcare. The evidence that we have seen so far, this meta-analysis by Halim and others indicate that out of 22 studies that they have reviewed, 21 of them show that childcare-related intervention can significantly change women's desire to be part of the labor market and hours of labor that they supply as well. My colleagues, Alitia and Kende, have also worked in DRC and Burkina Faso. They demonstrate that community-supported childcare facilities can significantly change women's participation in the labor market. I think this is also came earlier, when we talk about control over resources, this is also an important facet that dictates how women would like to use their time. Eliana's presentation on gender really dealt with quite extensively about it. And then the pluralistic ignorance that she talked about it is also important. People may have an inflated belief about others, belief that leads to a stigma that probably excludes them from labor market participation. Safety is also a concern. From previous work, we understand that women are happy to, not necessarily happy, but willing to experience a pay cut to work somewhere closer to their home than working in areas where they could be exposed to safety concerns. So the one area, at least in low-income countries, where there isn't a lot of evidence, concerns hiring and workplace discrimination. Here, there are a few projects that I'm aware of that are being started, trying to understand to what extent individuals' perception about women's role in the community, managers' perception about what women can achieve, can prevent them from being hired, retained, and promoted. So this is something I think a lot of evidence could be generated coming forward. Now, I have 45 seconds, so very quickly. I think there are several avenues for research, right? Some of it have already been mentioned. So the one area that I don't think we have done enough is to understand the implication of our intervention from the job search, facilitation, or broadly active labor market programs on firms. We improve much quality, but then does the productivity of the firm respond accordingly? I think there is something that we can really do a lot of work. And the long-term impacts of active labor market policies, spillovers, displacement effect. Just reiterating my point about fragility, conflict, and violence, and again, climate change being an integral component of it, that would lead to significant displacement of workers from one area to the other. How local labor markets react to these conditions is something that I think will grow in importance over time. Obviously, working from home, gig work, and innovative platform design have been tried in more developed settings, but how that can support labor market transformations with urbanization and growing labor market frictions in Africa and other contexts would become important as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thank you for keeping to time. And our last speaker is Mushfiq Mobarak from Yale.
Thank you. Thanks. I loved. So first in what we'll talk about. So since the title of the session is Labor and Migration, and we heard a lot about labor, and Supreet was going to talk about labor. She asked me to talk about migration, so I was happy to do that. So the way I'm going to frame this, though, it's a little bit more macro, right? So I'm going to try to frame it as, is there spatial misallocation, right, in labor markets? And is that actually an important cause of underdevelopment and low growth? So it is a little bit of an ambitious title, but it's partly because I loved Esther's comments earlier that it felt like being in a classroom today. I really felt that as well. And in addition, I felt like, like in the classroom when I was in grad school, I was trying to draw connections between fields. And so that's what's led me to go a little bit more macro. I've been editing my slides as I've been hearing others. Like this morning when we were talking about agriculture, in Tabneet's session, right? So my most striking reaction to observing agriculture in Malaysia, Bangladesh, India versus South Africa, Malawi versus, say, Brazil, right, is that they're so different, right? Like productivity in Brazil and the scale of agriculture is so different. It's almost misleading to call it, use the same word to describe both, right? And so that made me think, maybe Africa is also very land abundant, so maybe Africa should be thinking about Brazil as the model, right? Why don't we shift over? And that made me think about, or maybe there should be sort of a lot of intranational and international trade, and made me think about Dave's presentation, right? Similarly, when we were talking about education, right, it made me think about Eric's comments about industrial policy, right? So perhaps if you can raise the returns to education, automatically children and parents would react and take things differently and more seriously, and that might be the missing input, right? So I'm going to try and do that as well and try to connect to the macro, and I'll do that by just highlighting two facts about the spatial dimensions of productivity and wage gaps and seasonal dimensions of productivity and wage gaps. So I was inspired more by the policy discussions that we've been having. Like a lot of the side conversations with policymakers have been about like these bigger sort of growth questions. And then, in reaction to some of the talks I saw by Chris, Martina, Emily, Dean, like I'll make some comments about what comes in the future. Okay? All right, so here are my two facts. First is actually, this is from a macro paper, one of my favorite papers by Doug Gollin, Lagakos and Wa. It's an entirely descriptive paper. It's very, very simple. They just take data from about 70, 80 different countries, microdata, and they just show us what is the spatial productivity gaps. What's what are wages in urban areas versus rural areas, in agriculture versus non-agriculture. And their main point is the gaps are enormous, right? So the number is in the median country, or in the mean country, there's a 350% gap between urban and rural wages. Okay? Now, there's been some debate about this. Ted has written about this. We've followed up. Right? It's probably, like the cross-sectional gaps probably overstate things, right? But I think it's fair to say that there are large gaps. So if there are large gaps, then the immediate question that that raises at the micro level is that, is this an arbitrage opportunity? Why don't people just move from the rural to the urban area? Especially because we don't have any mobility constraints within countries usually, except for China, right? But at the macro level, right, it also raises the question, are people inefficiently spatially allocated within developing countries? And in particular, will we be able to generate a lot of growth simply by spatially reallocating people and encouraging movement? Okay? Now, again, this is not obvious because there's also a contrary view, right, coming somewhat from theory, somewhat from macro literature, that perhaps workers are already efficiently sorted across space, right? It's just that urban people and rural people have fundamentally different skills, so you cannot take the rural people, move them, and automatically generate growth, right? That's something that we should be thinking about. All right, so that's fact number one about the rural-urban wage gaps. And fact number two is that this rural-urban wage gap actually gets incredibly large during certain seasons, right? So the phrase hungry seasons has appeared several times over the last couple of days, right? That there is this period, and now it's been documented in many different settings, both in Asia and Africa, right? There are these periods where people are doing very, very poorly in rural areas because there's not much to do, right? There's excess labor there, okay? And I'll show you some data that I've been tracking for the last 15, 20 years in Bangladesh. This is just from 2016, but it looks similar any year. So there's certain periods like July, August, September, October. That's when, that's the pre-harvest lean season, and food insecurity rises. So it's a period, basically, why does it happen? It has to do with the crop cycle. You plant in July, there's demand for your labor, you work. You harvest in December, there's demand for labor, you work. In between, people are just waiting for the crop to grow. They're standing around, there's some weeding, et cetera, but there's not much to do, right? So then what happens is wages fall because labor demand falls. Unfortunately, prices rise because it's been the longest time since the last harvest, and the combination leads to lower caloric intake and this kind of food insecurity, where the majority of people tell you they don't get to eat 3 times a day, okay? So now, this is not a new phenomenon, by the way. One of my favorite journals, this is a paper from 1884. The British collected a lot of goods data in South Asia because they needed to collect taxes. There was seasonality back in the 19th century. And we've been tracking this now in DHS, LSMS surveys, imperfectly, like using the fact that there's variation in dates of interviews across the whole year. You see seasonality patterns in Africa, in Asia, even in things like stunting and wasting. Okay? So now, what are the implications and the macro as well as micro policy implications of this, right? So there's 2 ways that governments could go, right, in reaction to this low labor productivity in rural areas. One way would be, oh, maybe we should just try to create some job opportunities, right? NREGA, the world's largest public work program, is an example of that. There's not much to do during certain seasons. Maybe the government should be paying people to do something in rural areas. That's certainly one way you could go to help people. But a totally different approach would be, no, let's not worry about that. You know, people are in the wrong place, right? And if I can improve connectivity between rural and urban areas, that might be the better way for us to address the problem. And that is like, you know, something a finance minister or a prime minister should be thinking about, where to allocate their resources, right? And these 2 strategies turn out to be substitutes. Like Clément Imbert, John Papp have a nice paper that shows that if you do too much, if you do like the Food for Work program, that is actually going to distort decisions and keep people from migrating, right? Okay, so that's the macro implication. Now in the micro, there's been a lot of research over the last 20 years about whether we should be facilitating individual migration and search, just like Girum was just talking about, right? That could be, by the way, international migration. That could be internal rural-urban migration. It could even be migration across neighborhoods, like in his work, right? You know, let's move people from the residential areas and help them get to the commercial areas. Now, I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on internal migration, right? Not because it's the most transformative thing you can do. The returns to international migration are actually much, much larger, right? But it's because that's the much more common thing to do, and that's the thing that we can possibly help with, because altering visa entry policies in the United States, Canada, or South Africa is tough, but maybe we can do some little interventions to get people to move internally. And so that's what most people do. There's like many more times internal migrants than there are international migrants. Okay. So then in that literature, there's been a lot. So people have been asking the question, why don't people migrate, right? There's been a lot of work in Indonesia at those sites that migration is costly, right? A second issue is that people may have systematically wrong information, right? So why would they have systematically biased beliefs about the returns to migration? Those papers produced, I'll just tell you a story from my childhood, one of my favorite stories. My mom was normally a very serious person, very quiet person, right? So we had one of my uncles is a migrant. It's not an uncommon story in South Asia. So whenever he would come back from Abu Dhabi, he would tell us about how hard his life was, right? And my mom suddenly made this joke, I still remember that, apropos of nothing, you're bringing up how hard your life is, as if in the next moment we're going to ask you for money. Right. So that might be one reason why, migrants tell you that in order to lower the social tax, right? They might tell you systematically wrong things. Wages might be high, like I showed you with the macro data, but it might be risky. It might be uncertain, and people may not be willing to take that risk, especially very poor people, right? People might be stuck to rural areas because of some amenities that they cannot recreate in the urban areas. In the rural area, we have our informal insurance system, right? We need insurance. If you go to the urban area, maybe we won't be able to recreate that, and that keeps us too scared to migrate. Rural support programs like NREGA could hold you back, and there might be some non-wage amenities in urban areas like too much pollution, right, or something like that can hold you back. So in China, we're now observing migration patterns, which is very sensitive to the pollution in various cities, and that has aggregate productivity consequences. Also, there might be non-monetary disutility from migration, meaning like family separation, right? Things that are not so easy for us to measure, right, but they really matter to people, right? If I'm going to be away from my children, right, even though the wages are 3 times as high, right, that might keep me from moving. Yeah? And then sometimes there are just explicit policy restrictions, like we have in China and Vietnam, right, and some informal restrictions in India as well in terms of access to public services in the city. Right? Okay, so now how do we do this research? It often looks like this. This is from my own work, but we provide people money, they move to urban areas, hopefully they find work, and bring money back home or send money back home, right? But it doesn't have to be money. People could provide information. You could provide like search subsidies, et cetera, like Girum does, right? And so here I want to now come back to a comment that Martina made about scaling. And I want to, this is going to be my appeal to our profession as to how we might want to think about scaling. So let me tell you about how we did it in our context in seasonal migration in Bangladesh. So we had a first paper where we provided subsidies for people to migrate. And we got excited because it led to higher income, higher consumption. People were eating 3 times a day instead of 2 times a day, right? So then there was a question, shouldn't we be scaling this up? Very nice rich people wanted to scale this up, right? But then my reaction to that was, look, there's a lot we don't know yet, right? And when you start scaling up, and instead of what I did was encourage 2,000 people, if you start encouraging 20,000 or 200,000 people, the world might fundamentally look different, right? So one set of things we might want to think about is this non-economic outcomes. Things like, does the migration lead to more divorce? Does it change the relationship between husband and wife, father and children, right? Does it lead to more domestic violence? These are questions we should be asking, right? So we went ahead and asked those questions. Then there's this question about migration disutility, like how do I value the family separation, right? So here, my appeal would be, we do need to expand and connect to other fields and expand our methodological toolkit, because obviously I can't run in our city and ask people questions like, how much do you miss your kids? And then tell me the dollar value, how much you miss your kids, right? We have to think about it a little bit differently. And then as we scale up, right, there might be equilibrium changes, right? So the rural labor markets might be affected. If some people move, if a lot of people move, that might, let's imagine that food markets are not well integrated. People move out, they bring money back, that causes inflation. The non-migrants are worse off, right? Or I move away, and my friends who used to rely on me for informal insurance, they're worse off, right? Or that I move away, and people I competed with in the labor market, they might be better off, right? So that's another thing that we tested. And then as you move from 20,000 to 200,000, you might want to then start asking questions at the urban level. But the point is not that we shouldn't be playing with policy and doing interventions. The point here is we might want to continue asking questions as we scale up for questions that are relevant at that scale, right? We'll talk about political economy soon. We might also worry that when we encourage people to move out and wages rise, employers who are politically powerful, they might get upset, and that might actually shut down your program, even though it has nothing to do with the economic benefits generated by the program, right? So those are the types of questions that we should be continuing to ask. Okay? And then Chris's point about context relevance reminded me. So this is how bad sometimes external validity is. So I tried the same program that was successful in Bangladesh, literally 130 miles away in Nepal. It was a total failure, right? It was totally irrelevant. Why? Because people were already migrating. Why? Because the Nepal-India border is open. They were moving to places that were much higher wage. They already figured this out, right? But it was a totally different problem. People were migrating. There is still seasonal poverty, but it's because they couldn't easily send remittances back. They were bringing the money back, and it came back home at the wrong time, right? So obviously, our intervention then had to be very different. We just had to give them a way to speed up the remittance transfer process. Okay. All right. So a lot of and Dean's comments about how all these markets are intersecting across the different panels that we've had, right? So this is a consumption smoothing problem I'm talking about, like there's a hungry season, right? But it doesn't have to be migration. We could be thinking about credit markets that Emily talked about. That would be a solution to this, giving people loans. We could be talking about savings markets, like Pascaline's work, like giving people opportunities to save up for the next lean season, right? There's many ways